that Greek modes of dealing with alien gods turn out to be quite helpful for Romans at the points where they want to signal some gods as alien. Now, quite a lot of work on Greek thought at Rome treats it as disruptive. The idea is that Romans are quite happily pootling on in their sort of traditional way, and then they encounter Greek philosophy, and this worries them, and then they start rethinking it all. And this is an idea that's cropped up again and again. So works of Cicero and Varro are seen as responses to Greek philosophy, and in particular there's the book by Claudia Moite, which was mentioned by Valentina yesterday, La Raison de Rome, which actually argues that Rome experiences something a little bit like an enlightenment. And she's very clear, particularly, I haven't actually seen the English version, but in the French one, she's very clear that this is a direct parallel to the Aufklärung, the Enlightenment in a European sense. But of course, people have argued for enlightenments in the ancient world before, the Greek enlightenments, Ionian enlightenments. But in this case, it chimes with a view of Greek intellectual life as something that responds to the Greek world by becoming in some way more rational, whatever that means. Now, the timing of this has been put at different points by different people. Some would see it as the late 2nd century, Blosius of Cumae and so on. Elizabeth Rawson argued that it's largely refugees and more contact after the Mithridatic Wars. Some people say that it's the experience of people like Marcus and Quintus Cicero as they wander around Greece on their gap year, hanging out with philosophers, turning up in Athens and summoning the teachers of the schools to come to their villas to give them one-to-one tutorials and things like that. If we choose to understand all this in terms of a Roman Enlightenment, as Moite suggests, might it not have had the same sort of capacity to disrupt belief and practice that the kind of Enlightenment that Kate East was talking about did in early modern times? Should we see Greek reason as disrupting religious authority in a parallel way to the way in which the 17th, 18th, 19th century érudits began to challenge the authority of the established church? And I think my answer is, well, if so, it's going to be a rather different kind of enlightenment to the one that we know about later. Most of the approaches to the contact between the two, between religion and philosophy, or religion and Greek science in general, have started with the idea that Rome is a passive partner and Greek is the active. And I'm thinking about the work of Paul Vane, the work of Dennis Feeney, among more recent people, but others too, Andrew Wallace Hadrill, and lots of us actually have started from this sort of position that Rome is passive and Greece comes in and stirs it all up. Now, this seems to me to be a bit at odds with the ideas that increasingly people are coming up with, that Roman power actually changes the Greek world a lot. Mm-hmm. And that in many ways the Greek world is the passive one. And this is not very surprising. Rome calls all the shots. It's got the soldiers, it's got the money. It attracts people to Rome, but then they do what they're told if they want to earn a buck. So it's certainly not the case that the sort of Graecia Capta model of, I mean Horace, not Sue Alcott, the idea that sort of Rome accidentally gets civilized. It's one of these kind of justifications of empire. It's like the nice idea that the British conquered the world in a fit of absence of mind. Didn't really notice what was happening. You woke up one morning and we ran the British Empire. And I think what I want to do is experiment with the idea that it's the other way around. That we see that we focus on the choices that Romans make about what to use, what to pick, what to choose. That we see the domestication of philosophy and science in Rome not as an foreign invasion, but as just another case of appropriation analogous to, say, the creation of literature in Latin, or the adoption of new building techniques, or changes in representation, replacing terracotta statues with marble ones. All these sort of changes where Romans see, evaluate, pick, choose, modify, and fit alien stuff into something that they can use for themselves. And I suggest that we think about Greek philosophy as something which is being used in much the same sort of way. Cicero is happy to present himself at times as a cultural mediator, creating Latin calcs on Greek genre, Greek sciences, or even Greek philosophy, writing. But despite that imperialist conceit, we really are dealing with appropriation. So I think we should ask not what's the impact of the Greek science on Rome, but why did the Republican elite find some of this stuff useful, and what did they do with it? Now, Rome's been interested in philosophy for a long time. I mean, who knows exactly when this comes from? It's fantastically difficult to date. But we know that the story of the philosopher's embassy shows that in 155 BC, people are very interested in philosophy in Rome. And Nicholas Purcell has actually argued that stories about Pythagoreanism suggest an interest in philosophy in Rome and Italy more generally, even earlier. So this isn't a late, this isn't something people encounter late. It's been around all the time. It's only in the first century they're putting it to the uses I'm interested in. And I'm going to illustrate this in relation to two authors, to Caesar and to Cicero. Now, the surviving works of Caesar might seem to have very little to do with religious matters, although a strong case has been made by Montmiliano, modifying Weinstock, that Caesar had a special interest in them. He is, after all, the dedicatee of Varro's Antiquities, Human and Divine, a project that's not simply a sort of disinterested scholarly act of classification, but, if you like, an initial survey before putting into action changes and reforms. Remember, fundamentalist reforms of Roman religion, initiated many of them when Caesar's dictator. Varro's writings on religious matters survived only in fragments and paraphrases, but we can be sure of two things about them. Firstly, like Cicero and Caesar, Varro is well informed about philosophy of his day, as was Ennius and many others. Secondly, his interest in religious matters was focused on traditional cults of the Roman state. Varro is a mullah, he's a fundamentalist scholar. Cliff Ando argued that since Varro and Cicero each appropriated religion as a human creation, and since their interest is primarily in the local cults of the Roman people, not in religion across the world, their capacity to theorize religion at the imperial scale was very limited. There's no Roman version of Religionswissenschaft, of the comparative study of religions. When we have Roman writing about religion, is always writing about Roman religion. And quite likely the same is true of more shadowy figures like Nigidius Figulus and members of the previous generation as well. Passage of Caesar I want to discuss is how it gives us one example of Caesar thinking about the gods of alien people. This is, of course, from the Gallic War. And it forms part of what's conventionally called an ethnographic excursus. This chunk of Book 6 opens with the claim that Gallic society is riven by factio at every level, and then it goes on to sketch that divided whole, marking out the gulf between the rich and the poor, and then you've got a divided elite, the Druids and the Equites, priests and warriors, and the account of the Druid draws together material that Caesar certainly plundered from earlier ethnographic texts. Nobody really believes that Caesar's producing an eyewitness account of Gallic religion. He's not a guest of honour in the forest of the Carnutes when the Druids hold their Eisteddfod and fight each other for domination of the World Druid Organisation. Caesar has rummaged around a vast mass of writing already about Druids, some of which we know, some of which we don't, and as Federica said in another context, it's conventional at this moment to say Posidonius. Posidonius. Here's his description of the gods of the Gauls. Of the gods, the one they worship most is Mercury. They have many images of him, regard him as the inventor of all art. They consider him guide for their journeys and travels, and believe him to have great influence over the acquisition of gain and mercantile transactions. And then I'll let you read to yourself. Go on. They worship Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, Minerva. Regarding these deities, they have for most part the same beliefs as other nations. Gallic religion's the same as every other religion. Their beliefs are just like ours, and they worship the same gods. And I'm not even going to tell you what the alien names are. They're called Mercury, Apollo, Mars, and Jupiter. What we're seeing, in other words, is a complete assimilation of a Gallic cosmology to a Roman model. The passage carries on with accounts of battlefield trophies, the terrifying sanctions applied to those who plunder temples, the teaching of the Druids that the Gauls were all descended from Dis Pater, and so on. At the most basic level, this both the ethnographic form and the deployment here in its deployment in the text to retard the narrative is very conventional in terms of Greek historical writing, and much of the source material is Greek as well. But at a more fundamental level, the religious practices of this group of non-Romans have been packed into some pre-constructed taxonomies. Gallic religion is frightful, but at the same time a source of alien wisdom. Their rituals are repulsive, but their gods are the same as ours. It's notoriously difficult to join up these passages with any of the narrative of the Gallic Wars at all. If you cut this out, you'd never know there were Druids. They play no appreciable part in the politics, diplomacy, war that's revealed in the 8 books. Gallic religion has been stereotyped, contained. It's been put in a box, in other words. Now, putting alien gods in a box is what fundamentalists do. Let's move on to Cicero. I'm going to talk about just a couple of passages here. There's so much one could talk about. And I'm focusing particularly on Cicero's engagement with the gods of others. Both the De Natura Deorum and its sequel, if you like, the De Divinatione, illustrate this tendency perfectly. Because philosophy is by definition a universalizing discourse, a project in making claims that do not depend on local frames of reference, it lends itself to marginalizing local understandings. This is true of all philosophy, I think. The speakers in these dialogues treat the religions of other peoples with casual disdain. On the surface, De Natura Deorum is preoccupied with staging a conventional confrontation between philosophical schools, but in Roman dress, Philosophia Togata, as it's been called. But the religious traditions of anyone apart from the Greeks and Romans are rarely mentioned. But when they do appear, they're quite revealing. This passage is from Book 1 and from Velleius, who we heard about in the last paper, confident demolition of earlier ideas of the gods. Now, most of this is Velleius the Epicurean. It attacks the pre-Socratics and the Stoics, giving, in the process, a sort of philosophy 101 course to Romans who don't know who the most important Greek philosophers are. And that, I suppose, is part of the purpose of this dialogue. And then he says, what I presented to you are not so much the verdicts of philosophers as the dreams of madmen. Not much more absurd are the outpourings of the poets, which are more harmful because of the charm with which they're expressed. At least Greek philosophy is boring. When it's in poetry, you might be taken in. The poets have represented the gods as inflamed by anger, possessed by lusts. They've shown us their wars, their battles, their fighting, their wounds, their rivalries, hatreds and quarrels, their births, their deaths. Adulterous gods, gods in chains, gods having sex with mortals, mortal children being born to immortal parents. And alongside the mistakes made by the poets, we might classify the portents of the Magi and the Egyptians crazy in their own way. So Babylonian and Egyptian mythology is tagged on in one sentence, just as mad as Greek philosophy. Now, this line of criticism is an old one, or the one about Greek philosophy, that you can trace back to Xenophanes and other pre-Socratics. The idea that the gods of the poets are somehow not good enough to be gods. And when Cotta answers Velleius later in Book 1, he uses another Xenophantic trope. Romans do imagine Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Neptune, Vulcan, and Apollo in a particular way. He's talking about representations, of which I suppose statues are a fixed form, but neither the Egyptians nor the Syrians nor any other barbarians think of them in the same way. So this is the Xenophantic trope that horses and dogs had hands and could draw. They portray gods like horses and gods that look like dogs. All local knowledge is the most important. Nomos is king. And it goes on, Juno appears in one form to the Argives, another to the people of Lanuvium, another to the people of Romans, to the Romans, that Capitoline Jupiter and Jupiter Ammon are not the same, and so on. The multiplicity of local imaginations undermine each other, and they undermine all anthropomorphic views of the gods. The pre-Socratics have made this the basis for new accounts of the deity, but in the hands of Cotta the Stoic mouthpiece, it characterised as a critic here rather than a theorist, or self-characterised as a critic. It simply becomes more ammunition for attacking Epicurean anthropomorphic theology. Now, other people's gods don't feature at all in Book 2 of De Natura Deorum. I don't think there's any reference to them at all. The Stoic view is entirely sort of it simply dominates without reference to religion as actually practiced by anybody. But it does come back, as I said, in Book 3, and this is Cotter again. For to be honest, I cannot bring myself to despise the ignorance of common and uneducated people. So even commoners aren't. I can't despise them when I think of what the Stoics think about. Common, uneducated people believe this. Syrians worship a fish. Egyptians treat almost every kind of animal as sacred. Even in Greece, they believe many gods were once mortal humans. Alabandus is worshipped in Alabandra, and so on. So foreign gods become a freak show, and they become but they're a freak sideshow. That what they're doing is they're illustrating the weird kind of stuff you can believe if you're a foreigner. But even they are better than the beliefs of the Stoics, which are completely crazy. Cotter presses on with a catalogue. Sorry, this is Cotter the academic, of course. Cotter presses on with a catalogue about diversity and multiplicity of gods, how many Jupiters there are, how many Herculeses, minor gods, heroes, personifications. Almost all his examples are drawn from Greek and Roman myth, but Egyptian mythology pops in occasionally, so Thoth for Hermes and so on. Greeks and Romans had known about alien gods for a very long time. Attempts were being made in the 5th century BC, and for all we know earlier, the 5th century BC is when prose starts, but even earlier, to make connections between the different kinds of Hercules, the different kinds of Isis and Demeter, and so on. That syncretism, elaborate schemes of syncretism existed as well, like the Isaic aretology created in Ptolemaic Memphis, and under the Roman Empire, Platonists like Apuleius and particularly Plutarch would soon deploy the notion of daimon to differentiate the gods of myth and explain how you can still believe something about them while really believing in a more powerful god. Now, Cotter doesn't do any of those things, partly because he is constructing himself simply as someone who is a critic, is a skeptic, who attacks beliefs rather than offers them up. So his argument is much more like that of Augustine, and actually other Christian apologists make the same thing by trying to show the incoherence of traditional beliefs. De Divinatione makes a similar use of exotic cults. Divination is given a kind of barbaric genealogy in the opening chapters, starts with the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Egyptians. Then there's an enumeration of Greek oracles, reference to the auguries of Romulus, predictions of the haruspices, and it comes to be clear that divination is not something that's unwholesomely foreign. You might have thought that at the beginning, but actually everybody believes it. It's spread absolutely everywhere. And Quintus, cast by his brother to make the case for divination, musters lots of examples, mostly from Greek and Roman, a few from the Magi and others. At one point, this idea that divination is everywhere is made an argument in favour of its truth. The same practice of divination is not neglected even by barbarians. So even the barbarians believe it, so it must be true. Indeed, in Gaul there are the Druids, your guest and admirer Divitiacus the Aeduan, who claimed to be expert in that branch of knowledge the Greeks call physiologia, used to predict the future, sometimes auguries, sometimes through speculation. The Persians, the Magi, and they gather together just like you augurs. This is Quintus to his brother Cicero. So Druids, they're just like you augurs. They do exactly the same thing. Now Quintus continues a catalogue of different traditions, and he elaborates the thesis that the nature of the environment in which each people lives shapes the kind of divination they indulge in. And this is, again, it's a very Greek tactic. We can trace this back to the Hippocratic corpus, the idea that different kinds of climate and geography generate different national characters and different ethe, different customs, and this is also, Quintus says, reflected in local variants of divination, which is true everywhere. At one point, Cicero's response has much in common with Cotter's, as you'd expect, Cicero now playing the sceptical academic himself, and at one point he deploys Chaldean astrology as a way to exoticize astrology and show that it's all false. Now, I'm going very fast, I know, and the central point I've been trying to make in this paper is this, that these two Ciceronian dialogues, De Divinatione and De Natura Deorum, make essentially similar rhetorical uses of little tiny bits of information about alien religions. And they make them sometimes to support a case like Quintus in divination, sometimes to attack it. it's like there's a library there with a whole bunch of books with strange facts about alien peoples. And when it suits them, they'll take a book off the shelf and they'll deploy it, and then they'll put it back again. This isn't the same as a systematic science of religion. And it's certainly not the same as believing that that if you work hard enough on alien religions, you can get something out of them. Now that does happen in late antiquity. Glenn Bowersott's wonderful book Hellenism in Late Antiquity shows how Greek philosophy engages with Chaldean and Egyptian beliefs and creates a Neoplatonism that